This video lecture covers the agency problem. I'm your professor, Dr. Stephen Haggard.
Corporate governance has become a hot topic since the collapse of WorldCom and Enron. It was before then, but it's become even more important now. Remember, those companies collapsed amid accounting fraud and other managerial malfeasance. And so our hope through good corporate governance is to prevent bad behavior at corporations, including getting the managers to act on the behalf of the shareholders, which they are supposed to do, and also to obey all applicable rules, regulations, laws, and ethical guidelines. So let's talk a little bit about how corporate governance works at the corporation. First of all, the shareholders elect the board of directors, and the job of the board of the directors is to represent the interests of the shareholders. And they also hire, compensate, and fire managers, the CEO, and the people who work for the CEO. And so the board of directors should be doing this hiring, compensating, and firing on the behalf of the shareholders, not on the behalf of the managers. But sometimes we see the CEO as the board chair. In other words, she is the head of the board of directors. And this seems to me to represent a conflict of interest, because then the CEO belongs to both the group of managers and to the group assigned to monitor the managers. And so we see a potential conflict of interest there. And experts in the field of corporate governance are fairly adamant that we are better off to separate the roles of CEO and chairperson of the board.
What is the agency problem? It's when people expend other people's resources differently than they would their own. Let me give you an example that may be familiar to you. Think in your head about what car you would like. And first let's think about what kind of car it would be if your parents were paying for it. Do you have that car in your head? Now let's think about what kind of car it would be if you were paying for it. I know in my own head it goes from being a BMW 3 Series to being a Honda Accord. I'll give you another example of the agency problem, this one in healthcare. Whenever I go to the dentist, they always want to x-ray my teeth, and I haven't had a cavity since I was 12, so this is really a waste of resources. They always say to me, "Would you like us to x-ray your teeth?" And I say no. And then they say, "It's okay. Your insurance will pay for it." Why do they think my decision will be different depending on who's paying for it? If the money doesn't come out of our own pocket, we don't feel the pain nearly as acutely. And we will see this is the case between managers of firms and owners of firms. In fact, that leads us to our next question. Where does the agency problem come from? It's the separation of ownership and control. In small firms, such as sole proprietorships, ownership and control are invested in the same person, meaning that the manager of the firm also owns the firm. Every time the manager wastes $1 of the firm's money, it costs the manager $1 out of his own pocket. But if we have a manager that only owns 1% of the firm, then that manager only bears 1% of the wasteful spending that they do on the job. When they waste $1 of the company's money, it really only costs them a penny.
So how does the agency problem manifest itself at corporations? Well, the easiest one to see is wasteful spending. This is when managers spend the shareholders' money differently than they would spend their own. When managers fly on the company's dime, they almost always insist on using private jets. But when they travel on their own dime, strangely enough, they find themselves on commercial planes. Why is that? It's because they don't spend the company's money in the same way that they would spend their own. They're not as careful with other people's money. But this is typical of human beings. The next thing we see is empire building. And this is where managers are intent on growing the company whether it increases shareholder wealth or not. Remember that the goal of financial management is not to make the company as big as possible. It's to maximize shareholder wealth. And you can expand the company in ways that actually destroys shareholder wealth. And so you may see managers expanding the company in ways that destroy shareholder wealth. Why would they do such a thing? Well, it boils down to the CEO of a $200 million in sales company is more important than the CEO of a $100 million in annual sales company. And such a person would undoubtedly be entitled to more compensation, would probably be able to have more secretaries, would probably be able to have a better corporate jet, to get a better tea time at the country club, and so on. And so CEOs wanting to be leaders of larger companies will often try to expand the company at the shareholders' expense. And finally, there is shirking. Shirking is the opposite of working. And if you're a human being and you've worked for someone else, undoubtedly you are familiar with shirking. I had a man named Roy that worked for me in Dallas, Texas. And when Roy was working for me, Roy moved very slowly. And I just assumed that this was Roy's normal tempo. Then one weekend, my wife and I were out driving around, and we found ourselves in front of Roy's house. And I saw Roy working on a personal project for himself in his own yard. And he was running back and forth and working very hard. And I told my wife, "There's something wrong with Roy. I've never seen him move that fast before in all of our time together." Why was Roy working faster? Because Roy was working for himself. When Roy worked for me, he got paid the same amount per hour regardless of how hard he worked. CEOs tend to shirk as well. Especially if the company gets to be successful, then the CEO tends to relax. And the older the CEO is, the more likely this is to happen, because the CEO has less time left in the managerial labor market, and also, sadly, has less energy to devote to the firm. As I get older, I feel this in myself, that I have less energy to devote to my pursuits in life.
Now I'll share an example with you about the agency problem in real life. When I first became a salesperson, I was told that my sales manager, whose name was Bob, would insist on going with me on my first tour of my customers. That was probably a good idea, since I had never met these people before and he could introduce me, and I also had never sold anything before, so I needed some hands-on training. But I was also warned that Bob would find the most expensive steakhouse possible, rack up an enormous bill, and then tell me to put it on my expense account. So I was prepared. Our first trip was to Atlanta, Georgia. We checked into the Hampton Inn, at which point Bob went over to the little bar where they had the cookies and the coffee and filled his suit pockets with cookies. Bob then went to the desk and asked the young lady behind the desk where he could get a good steak. She said, "Do you want a merely good steak or do you want a great steak?" Bob said, "I want a great steak." And she told us where to go. It was about 1.5 miles further down the road. Bob went to his room and I went to my room and we freshened up and then went back in the lobby. And after about an hour in Atlanta traffic, we had moved 1.5 miles to this steakhouse. We got out of the car and we walked in, and it was obviously a very nice place. Here's how you know when you're in a nice steakhouse. Everything on the menu is a la carte. Your steak doesn't come with a potato or anything like that. Everything is a la carte. And they will actually give you a napkin to match your dress slacks. Very confusing at first. I thought they were stealing my napkin, but truly they were just replacing it with one that would match my pants. So Bob and I are seated, and our server approaches the table. She is visibly pregnant, I'm guessing about 8.5 months. Bob proceeds to flirt with her. Now, so far, Bob has not engaged in any agency behavior. He's just been a little bit crude. Now, we get to the menus. I start to look at the menu. And I'm self-conscious. Of course, it's my first trip as a salesperson, and I'm trying to be conscious of spending the company's money. So I decide I'm going to have a steak burger, some fries, and a glass of iced tea. Bob, on the other hand, asks the server what's good. If you ask a server what's good, what do you think the server is going to point out? Probably something more expensive, because they figure you'll be tipping on the percentage of the bill. Especially since they spotted Bob and I as traveling on expense accounts, they figured that they would get a good tip. So, of course, the server recommends a very expensive cut of meat, and Bob says, "That's great, I'll have one of those." And then Bob also proceeded to order one of every of the side items. Now remember, this place is a la carte. And so he ordered one of everything, including asparagus, which, while it is disgusting, actually costs quite a bit. He also ordered the second most expensive bottle of wine on the list. Maybe it wasn't second most expensive, but it was pricey, at least from where I was standing. Okay, so they bring us our food, and Bob eats about half of his steak, and he nibbles on a little of each side item, and I'm fairly sure he didn't try any of the asparagus. It just sat there and looked sad and limp. When the meal was over, they brought us our check, and as had been predicted by my colleagues, Bob slid the check across the table to me and said, "Put that on your expense report." So I opened up the bill to look at it. It was $300. Now keep in mind, the year was 2001. Even today, when you walk into a restaurant and run up a $300 tab, that's pretty sizable. In 2001, it was even worse. Now, I'm looking at the bill, and I'm pulling out my company credit card. Do you think I hesitated to pay the bill? Absolutely not. Why? It wasn't my money. It was the company's money. That's the first manifestation of the agency problem here. The second, of course, is that Bob has ordered all sorts of things that he's not even really going to consume, that are very pricey for the menu. Now, let's think about this. Bob owned 1% of the firm. It's a $300 bill that we ran up at the steakhouse. How much did that meal really cost Bob? The answer, 1% of $300, or $3, which is coincidentally what Bob would spend to eat at Taco Bell when he was eating on his own dime. Hopefully now you can understand about the agency problem and how it comes up, and how people behave differently when they're spending other people's money. If you ever have any doubt about this, remember back to the example about how children spend their parents' money versus their own.
So now we know what the agency problem is. How do we go about controlling it? Well, the first thing we can do is design the manager's compensation contract, how they get paid, to where the managers only get rich when the shareholders get rich. How do we do that? Well, the first way we could do it is just to give the manager stock. And that way, when the stock price goes up, the manager has more money. But that's kind of expensive, so why don't we do something called stock options? A stock option would be where we give the manager the right to buy the stock at a price that is above the current share price at some date in the future. Such options only have value if the share price of the firm rises above that set price before the future date. Why would that be desirable? Because as the share price goes up, then shareholder wealth goes up proportionally. So that's how we can design managerial compensation contracts to help limit this agency problem. By the way, we will never eliminate the agency problem. We can only do our best to minimize the agency problem. Next, there's the managerial labor market. Many people find it odd to think of CEOs as labor, but anybody who trades their time for money is indeed labor, including your professor. So they are part of what is called the managerial labor market. If they ever want another job, they will have to put themselves back into this managerial labor market. And it turns out that CEOs are a rather small group of people. It's a small profession, and people know what CEOs do. As the CEO of a decent-sized firm, there's a good chance that if you did something bad, it would wind up in the Wall Street Journal. In fact, these are some of my favorite articles to read in the Wall Street Journal about how managers have been spending the shareholders' money foolishly or doing crazy things at the firm. And so it's this reputation in the managerial labor market that might constrain bad behavior on the part of managers, knowing that at some point they may have to go back out there and try to get another CEO job. They avoid bad behavior. Now, the managerial labor market is a more effective constraint on younger CEOs. Why? Because there is a greater chance those people will be back in the managerial labor market. But if you're 61 years old and you can avoid getting fired from your current firm, there's a good chance that you'll never be in the managerial labor market again. And as a result, that might not be much of a constraint on you. The next constraint we see is the market for corporate control. Corporate control, we're talking about takeovers here. And if someone manages to take over my firm, there's a good chance that I as the CEO will get fired. Why? Why do companies get taken over? Usually because the current management has done a bad job and the stock price has dropped low enough that the company becomes an attractive takeover target for bidding firms. And so when those bidding firms come in and take the firm over, they're not going to keep that CEO in place because that CEO has been doing a bad job. So how can you avoid getting taken over? Well, do a good enough job that you keep your share price high enough that your firm is not an attractive takeover target. And that's how the market for corporate control helps to improve the behavior of managers at firms. And finally, there's monitoring, basically watching. If you go to Taco Bell and look around, you will see that there are lots of cameras. But the cameras mostly are not for watching the customers. They're for watching the employees. Why? Because the employees can steal from the cash register. The customers might start a fight in the dining room and break a chair or two, but they're not going to empty several $100s out of the cash drawer. And so that's what we would call monitoring. People tend to act better when they know they are being watched. That's why you see these fake security cameras for sale. If you put one of those in the corner of a room, people that go into that room will tend to act better. What kind of monitoring do we see at corporations? Typically, large shareholders have a big enough stake that it makes sense for them to monitor the CEOs of the firm. They might do so by getting a seat on the board. They might also hire analysts to check up on the CEO, but all of this is rather expensive and time-consuming. If you as a small investor only own 10 shares of a company, it's not worth your while to monitor the CEO. And so what do? You free ride on the monitoring provided by the large shareholders who do have the proper incentives to monitor the CEOs.